Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. Today's episode of Legal Tea is the Cautionary Tales topic. And on these Cautionary Tales episodes of Legal Tea, we normally talk about either real-life cases, real-life clients that are things me or my office have worked on, or they are things that I think are just generally good things to know and be aware of so that you do not turn into a cautionary tale on my podcast one day. Well, today is more of the latter. I recently asked on Twitter or X some general topics to dive into on this podcast. I was feeling a little uninspired, so thanks for all who chimed in. Someone mentioned doing like a top 5 or top 10 or whatever mistakes that other professionals make regarding estate planning, and I was like, oh, that's a good one. I said at the end of my last episode that I think that person suggested doing financial advisors only. And transparently, I usually script these episodes out. But today I'm going all natural. So we'll see where things go, or how things go, I guess I should say. In total, I'm going to go over the top 5 mistakes that I see and hear other professionals make or say about my estate planning world. And I hope this episode does nothing but inspire all of us, including my own profession, to be more collaborative and more holistic with our planning. So that at the end of the day, that's just going to benefit the client the most, right? So let's dive in. Mistake number 1 is assuming a client needs something basic or needs, quote, just a will. You can imagine the look of surprise that I get, or even perhaps the frustration that a client experiences if they share something with me that perhaps involves something, more than just really a basic will. So say, for example, I work with young families sometimes that want to control distributions based on age. So if something happens to them, their child or their children are under the age of 18, they do not want that child at 18 to get an inheritance outright. I know what I would have done with money at 18. Or say I'm working with someone that may have a special needs beneficiary, or even someone that has a beneficiary that may be experiencing some personal things going on, personal problems, personal issues, whatever you want to call it, such as drug or alcohol addictions or gambling addictions, or spendthrift issues, or governmental benefits that they're on, like Medicaid. Sometimes even clients that appear to have a very basic need disclose something to someone like me that we may be able to do something to protect that beneficiary through, say, types of planning that is more than just a basic old will. Rather, they may benefit from doing more advanced planning, say through like a trust, to allow control of how that beneficiary inherits. So what I would encourage professionals to do is merely emphasize the importance of estate planning, generally speaking, and not really say, I think you need a will. Or say to someone like me, this client just needs something really basic. Do you really know that? Or are you just making some assumptions? I consider myself a lifelong learner. So if you ever have a client that you thought going into that estate planning conversation would warrant a very basic plan, and then the client boomerangs back to you and says that they're doing something more than just a basic plan, what I would encourage you to do is pick up the phone or shoot an email to the attorney to better understand why they may be recommending something. You could have a blind spot, guys, or you maybe there's an opportunity for you to better understand my world and what options exist and what best options exist for your clients. Mistake number 2 is kind of along the same lines. So setting expectations with clients of what they need or the approximate cost. So yes, very similar to the first mistake that I just went through. But it's a little different because it's more generally speaking. And here's an example. This may be similar to, from my seat, if I say to someone, who asks my opinion on a reverse mortgage or an annuity product. Both of these are a bit controversial, I would argue, in the financial space. And, I'm certain there are examples where a reverse mortgage or an annuity is a perfect product for someone. At the end of the day, those are both far outside of my legal lane, right? So it's very similar in that regard that I am not going to recommend or even not recommend any type of financial product to a client because that's not my world. That's not my lane. I'm not going to set expectations with the client that XYZ financial product is not the best thing for them. And it's the same exact thing with legal fees and general costs. I think at the end of the day, most professionals would be most comfortable with them controlling the conversation as it relates to fees and the cost of things, right? I think that's fair to say. I would say, we could probably all agree that part of our job is explaining the various options on the table, but also explaining the value of all of those options. A lot of the time, in these conversations, it's really explaining the pros and cons and consequences and benefits of each option. And of course, many clients, if they just see the dollar figure, they just see the fee, they may not yet understand what is all embedded in that fee. Like why option C, which is the most expensive, may be the best one for them. Or option A, which is the least expensive, would be perhaps, fine and dandy. Mistake number 3 is assuming that specifically irrevocable trusts are the same irrevocable trusts that existed 20 plus years ago. Honestly, this is a little bit of a personal frustration of mine. My office does a lot of trust planning, specifically with irrevocable trusts, to gain asset protection against long-term care or even asset protection against lawsuits and creditors. Now, sometimes when I talk to a client about an irrevocable trust for asset protection purposes, they will end up sharing what they are considering with their advisor or their tax professional. And often those other professionals are thinking of irrevocable trusts from 20 plus years ago, and they'll say, oh, you don't want to do that. And they'll talk the client out of the plan. The same client that were so gung-ho about doing this plan and perhaps the best option for them. Clients may get squirmy. They may back out and then, get hit with some major consequences down the road, all because the other professional did not fully understand the irrevocable trust. Often, it's that they just don't realize the irrevocable trusts today they're not the same ones that got set up 20 plus years ago. They're just not. For example, a lot of professionals think that all irrevocable trusts have their own separate tax ID number, which often yields like a different or higher tax bracket. Well, did you know that there are irrevocable trusts nowadays that can be set up that are filed under a client social security number? They're called grantor trusts for tax purposes. And what that means is they do not yield a different and higher tax bracket. And actually, taxes don't change at all. And that is just one example of how drastically different irrevocable trusts are today that were, getting created 20 plus years ago. So what I would encourage you to do is if you hear the term of art irrevocable trust, certainly ask questions about how it works. And I would actually ask the questions directly to the attorney and not through a client because you may confuse the client. And also, do know kind of simultaneously that there are still irrevocable trusts that are getting set up today that are just the same ones that were set up 20 plus years ago, and that's fine too. So it's just a matter of, not making assumptions and at the same time asking questions if you do have concerns or if you are confused about the type of irrevocable trust that is getting set up. Mistake number 4 is getting stuck on taxes over everything else. So what I mean by this is I truly, truly understand that a lot of financial and tax professionals that they consider one of the most important parts of their job is to navigate a client's financial or tax plan in the most tax-friendly manner. That is setting up a plan that will minimize taxes for the client, right? But from my seat, sometimes a client wants to do a very certain type of plan or maybe accomplish a very certain type of goal that sort of reminds me of the saying, you can't have your cake and eat it too. An example of this is, I work with clients all the time that, may have a beneficiary that is a massive spendthrift. They cannot save $1 to save their life. So oftentimes in those cases, what we end up doing is we set up trusts for those individuals to inherit. That way, we can put someone else in charge of their inheritance and kind of set up a plan on how the inheritance gets distributed out to that beneficiary. Simultaneously, a lot of folks also have retirement plans, and more specifically, pre-tax retirement plans. So what we have to do is we kind of have to balance taxes against customized distribution wishes. Whether we want the balance of those pre-tax retirement accounts going into a trust for a beneficiary like this is where we may have to, where we may want to control from the grave and spell out instructions on how this person inherits, but in doing so may not be the most tax advantageous method. So I think, on this mistake, it's really just making sure that all the professionals are being collaborative and understanding that from a 50,000-foot overview, what the client is trying to accomplish and doing so in a way that makes sense from everyone's seats, from the client's seat, from the attorney's seat, from the financial seat, the tax seat, etc. So that's what I mean by it's not all about taxes. Lastly, mistake number 5 is that beneficiary designations are not the answer to everything, my friends. I know. Beneficiary designations help clients avoid probate. But why I consider this a mistake is, a perfect example of this is, say, if we place beneficiary designations on every single asset, then the person passes away, and now those assets are getting distributed to those beneficiaries, right? Well, as many know, those assets don't go into like a big old pot. They get distributed directly to the human beneficiaries. So this big old pot, it doesn't exist to be used to pay debts and expenses, etc. It just gets distributed to beneficiaries. So once assets get distributed directly to those beneficiaries, think about bills coming in and debts to be paid and taxes to be filed. Like, who's paying the tax professional? And what if taxes are owed? You can imagine a situation where perhaps beneficiaries receive their share of an asset, and since it does not go into one pot, if it's distributed through beneficiary designations, you can imagine that after debts and expenses, not after debts and expenses, excuse me. So you can imagine a beneficiary who is technically not obligated to also share in paying off those debts and expenses. Then because they are being, that way, kind of being a little bit of a turd, other beneficiaries have to chip in more. So in a strange way, using just beneficiary designations forces beneficiaries to agree and to share and to kumbaya. And I don't know about you, but when money is on the table, I see things get weird. So back to the whole 50,000-foot overview of what the client is trying to accomplish, but doing so in a way that makes sense from everyone's seat. And now also including the beneficiary's seat. And this is just another example of making sure that we are not getting so laser focused on one particular thing. And in this example, it's just avoiding probate. And in the meanwhile, forgetting that there may be other things to consider. Alrighty, that's it. That episode went quick. Maybe it's because I was just kind of blabbing and didn't script it out. But shifting to next week's episode, sneak peek of next week, we are circling back to the current trends topic where we talk about things that are going on currently that impact my estate and elder law world, or maybe things that I've seen on, the news or social media that are relevant to this podcast. Well, next week's episode, maybe that's why I should script things out. On next week's episode, I'm going to share a few things that I have shifted in my own law firm to make sure my team members are staying happy with all the changes and, work-life balance and culture and all that sort of stuff, because I firmly believe that happy employees will lead to happier clients. So it'll be something kind of different next week for sure. Tune in for that next time. And until then, be well and talk soon.